We are pleased today to have David Bundy with us. Mr. Bundy took his bachelor's degree at Grinnell College. It's in Des Moines some years ago, and he has worked for a number of news and publishing outlets since, including the Tribune in Bismarck, North Dakota, the Suburban Journals of Greater St. Louis, and he did work here in Lincoln as the news editor, but that was in the last century, as we would laugh. He returned to Lincoln in 2012 to become the editor-in-chief of the Lincoln Journal-Star, the position that he holds today. Mr. Bundy.
All right. One thing to do, that's remember to turn the on switch on, and I did it. Just a quick correction. Grinnell is in Grinnell, Iowa, and Des Moines is where we went for Chinese food, because Grinnell didn't have any. So I am the editor of the Journal-Star. Just so people have an idea, people call the editor because they think I'm in charge of everything, but like everybody, I have a boss. My boss is the publisher, and she oversees all of the departments in the newspaper. The news department is just my favorite department. But I've been in journalism for about 30 years. About 15 of that, I have been the top executive in the news department, either the editor or the editorial director. And in that time, I have been insulted in more ways than you could imagine. And I've really come to appreciate a good insult. I mean, the routine ones are, you're too left-leaning. I get some of the, you're too right-leaning, but it tends to be sort of the community that I'm in. I try to play it straight down the middle. I get, you're too wishy-washy. I get, you print dirty words in the newspaper, and then when I don't print the dirty words in the newspaper, I get complaints that I'm censoring the news. I had an argument about that last week. One of my all-time favorites that I liked so much I had to come home and share it with my kids was a guy was trying to imagine what fantasy world I lived in, and he said, it must just be full of blue skies and rainbows and unicorns pooping Skittles. And my kids just loved that. So if you ever do want to call, my number's in the paper, and I do appreciate an original insult, if that's what you feel like you need to do. But when people really want to insult me, the one that they go to the most that, and they just spit it at me like it's the worst thing, most hurtful thing they could say to me is, you just do that to sell papers. And for the first few years of my career, I thought, well, that's really awful. We're exploiting people. And then I realized, well, wait a minute. I'm in a business, and our business is to sell newspapers. So I need to be fair. I need to be kind. I need to minimize harm. There are lots of ethical guidelines that, as a journalist, I practice. But if I've accomplished all those things, I ought to sell papers. I mean, nobody complains to McDonald's that, oh, you make Big Macs. The secret sauce on Big Macs just tastes good so you can sell more Big Macs. So I tend not to get defensive anymore and just kind of laugh when people say, oh, you just want to sell papers. And you know what sells papers? Crime reporting. It's just a fact. People are interested in it. And we've known it for a long time, but there's this kind of crazy disconnect. Long before the internet, the only way we understood, excuse me, the only way we could understand what people wanted to read in the paper was calling them on the phone during their dinner hour and asking them. We'd ask them questions like, how interested are you in the weather? How satisfied are you in the Journal-Star's coverage of the weather? How interested are you in business reporting? And how satisfied are you? And then we'd say, how interested are you in crime and justice in your community? And how does the Journal-Star satisfy that interest? And people always say, I don't want to read that negative stuff. They'd say, oh, that stuff just paints us in a bad light in our community. We need more positive news. They always say that. But it's kind of like pornography. If I ask 100 people, do you like internet pornography? Everybody's going to say, oh, that is awful, awful stuff. But somebody's looking at it. And it's the same thing with, to a lesser degree, crime and justice reporting in the newspaper. People don't want to admit that they like reading about crime, but they like reading about crime. And in the old days, the way we knew it was, if we put a crime story above the fold in a newspaper, so you could see it in a newspaper rack that you walked by on the street, or you saw it next to the checkout at a convenience store, if there was a crime story up there, people were more likely to buy it. We would track day to day what stories were above the fold and how many extra single copy papers we sold. And when there was a story about a crime or about a big trial or something like that, we sold more papers. And it was just a fact, and we had to wrestle with this because it was still sort of anecdotal, but it seemed to point to the fact that people are interested in crime reporting. Now with the internet, life has gotten a lot easier for us. We still have people who call and say, I only want the happy news, but I have a little program called Chartbeat, and it allows me to call up the homepage on my website for journalstar.com, and I can see how many people are reading each story at any moment. I can tell whether they came from Facebook to our website. You can sort of tell where they live, or you can at least tell what server they're going through to access our website. But I can know which stories are popular and which stories aren't. And we use that information to try to make our website more interesting because we like to have readers. And it's this crime and courts reporting that really seems to be what draws people to our website. Part of it is it happens during the day when people are awake, and actually it happens when people are at work. How many of you right now have a smartphone with you close enough that you could grab it if it buzzed or dinged or whatever? Lots of you. Has anybody gotten a news alert since we got in here about something happening? I don't think I have. I might have gotten a text from my sister, but see if the Journal Star sent out any alerts. If nothing's happened with Husker football, we probably haven't sent out an alert in a little while. That tends to be what we're doing a lot of these days. Actually, though, we sent out an alert about a half hour ago, 45 minutes ago, about shots were fired into a house that 5 people were living in. Now, I didn't click on that to go back and look at the story, but I better later, because I'm the editor of the newspaper. I better know what we're doing. But people are coming to us now for this crime and courts coverage, and it's complicated. You know, it's still a difficult issue for us. We want to present a picture of the community that's fair. People spend their tax dollars for security on the police. So we think it's fair for people to know what's going on there. But one of the things, and we've all seen dozens of examples, crime reporting has become almost a source of entertainment. I mean, a crime story is often the kind of story that goes viral, you know, a dumb criminal. 20 years ago, when I was the news editor of the paper, I remember this story vividly because we talked about it endlessly for a day. So I guess that's not endlessly, sorry about that. There was a guy, he got pulled over for drunken driving here in Lincoln. He desperately did not want to take the breathalyzer test. So he was doing everything he could to avoid that. And he made it hard on the police. I think they ended up having to take him back to the station. And in a last-ditch effort, he said he really needed to go to the bathroom. He went into the bathroom, and guys will be familiar with this, women may be familiar too. There's something in a urinal called a urinal cake. It's a little thing that looks a lot like a little styrofoam disc or whatever. He grabbed it and took a great big bite of the urinal cake. He was going to foul up this breathalyzer test by trying to eat a cleanser and deodorizer. And does that seem like a newsworthy story? I mean, it depends on how it's written, I suppose. You could do a whole piece on things you shouldn't eat in public restrooms. There's just, 10 ways to avoid a breathalyzer test that aren't going to work. We put that story on the front page of the paper. It was short, and I spent a long time that night. Everybody wanted to write the headline for that. I think we ended up with something like, "Big Blue Breath Mint Doesn't Help DUI Suspect." In that story, we did not name the person who was eventually arrested. We didn't want to open him up to ridicule, and we have other standards that I'll get to in a little bit. But that's a case where did we write a story just to sell newspapers? Well, yeah, kinda. And did we hurt this other human being? Well, we didn't print his name, which was a mitigating factor. Was there an overriding public safety concern that caused us to print this? No. But 20 years ago, it seemed kind of entertaining. And now stories like this are all over the internet. And it sort of changed the way people think about the reporting of crime in courts. A story like that could get us sued just as easily as a hard-hitting piece on somebody who's allegedly dealing K2. But, we still are trying to put out a newspaper that's both constructive and entertaining. And we debated how we wanted to handle that story. Some people thought it was a mistake to write it at all. Some people thought it should be short and not on the front page. And it comes down to, I don't know that there's really a right answer on any of those things. The way we phrase it, when we have a long, long argument about whether a story should be on an inside page or the front page, we come back and we say, well, you can always argue story play. And that means, okay, just be quiet and do whatever the editor says. With the internet now, though, we don't really have time to think. With that story about the Big Blue Breath Mint, we had time to deliberate. I mean, it was a funny story, but we had serious conversations about it that day. We probably off and on spent an hour, which for people with short attention spans, like most people in the news media, that's a really long time. But now with the internet, things happen really fast. And, you're the kind of people that we want to read our newspaper. So we need to reach you on your smartphone, and we need to reach you with news when it happens. So we do things now that we didn't used to do. I look back at our old news rules from 20 years ago when I was the news editor, and one of the rules was never write off the police scanner. We have police scanners scattered throughout the newsroom, and they're going all the time. The Cops and Courts reporter has one permanently attached to his body, and it's very disconcerting to go into the men's room and have him already be in there and hear the voice of a police dispatcher talking to you. But we listen to the scanner, and nowadays, people want to know, hey, what were those sirens I just heard go by my office? We have to answer those questions. And the first answer is often, this is what we heard on a police scanner. And we'll write that up and we'll throw that up on our website. We're generally not going to send out a news alert with that because there's not a lot of information to it. But people want to know. Except for the ones that don't. Some people complain, as soon as a story is up like that, they'll say, why aren't there more facts? Well, there aren't more facts because there's nothing that's happened yet. We don't know. So we're sort of caught. People want to know instantly, but we're not like a Law and Order episode where just exactly the right thing happens at the right time and we can post it. We don't know what we don't know. There can be a house fire and people will say, is someone injured in it? Well, has anybody ever gone to the scene of a house fire? Even a small one is fairly chaotic. People are running around, there's water spraying, it smells like smoke because there's a lot of smoke. And the firefighters are trained, they're not going to talk to you. They're going to do exactly what you think firefighters ought to do, which is try to save people and try to save property. So they're not going to stop and tell you, yes, there are 3 people still in the building and we're trying to get them out. Or we got everybody out and we found a litter of puppies that we rescued. Aren't they cute? We'd love that. We'd love to take pictures of that. Put that on the front page, by the way. Puppies still do pretty well, even in the age of crime. So do cute kids. So we'll write off the scanner now and we'll tell people what we know as soon as we know it. And we try to tell them this is all that we know. We'll send a reporter and a photographer out as quickly as possible. Usually the photographer is a little bit later than the reporter because the reporter just has to grab a notebook and their phone. And they can get out there and they can take raw video. We're set up now so that they can write a story at the scene and post it immediately to the internet. Some newspapers do that. We're still not comfortable with that. We have the story flow into our system so at least somebody reads it. But there are some good-sized papers that allow reporters to post directly to the internet for people to see. And then they'll go back and edit those stories kind of on the back end. That's a dangerous thing to do for lots of reasons. Just everybody needs an editor, but once something goes up on the internet, it's there for everybody to see. And near as I can tell, it's really hard to get something off the internet once it's up there. And we'll talk about that in a second too. One of the things that kind of caught us off guard was photographs on the internet. We'd send a reporter out to the scene of a bad car accident. And we learned very quickly, don't take a photo that shows a license plate. Because if the car accident is a fatal accident, somebody in the family may be able to identify a relative that was in that accident by the license plate. Same goes for a distinctive car. I can remember we ran a photo of, it was a beautiful silver Porsche that got, it ran into a pole or something. And, how many beautiful silver Porsches like that are in Lincoln? Well, at least a handful of them. But as soon as that went up, readers called us on it and said, don't you think that's a rare enough car in Lincoln that you're getting word out to people about an accident before the family can be informed? And there are things like that. 20 years ago, the issue was, and I can remember this happened, these two things happened in consecutive weeks. One was, it was just a beautiful wintertime photo of some kids out building a snowman. We took a picture of it. It was a cute snowman. And it wasn't until I walked in the next day and somebody handed me the paper and said, didn't you see this? That I realized they used pine cones to make the snowman anatomically correct. I wish I'd caught it. The next week I did. We ran this feature called Faces in the Crowd. And it's where we asked a question. And then we took a photo of a mugshot of each person and put their answer underneath. And one of the guys had a hat. It looked like a hat that had the organ donor logo on it, but when you read it closely, it said orgasm donor. I caught that one. I was really proud of myself. But that's the kind of thing that it's harder to catch in the internet age when a story is going to come in. We have 5 minutes to read the story, take 2 quick looks at the photograph and make sure that there's nothing that's going to get us in big trouble. And we can take stuff down if we have a big problem with it, but as a newspaper and as the editor of a newspaper, credibility is hugely important to us. And having something stupid or wrong up, even for a couple of minutes, does us a lot of harm. So we feel like we're kind of caught. People want the news as fast as they can get it, but they want the whole story and they don't want anything incomplete. Before we were geared to deal with crime stories, justice type stories, court stories, we had a deadline. I mean, we still have a print deadline. It's 11:40 p.m. If your story isn't in and on a page by 11:40, it missed the bus, and it's not going to be in the print publication until the next day. And we have 24 hours. If we have a hard story, you miss the deadline, you kick the can down the road, and you talk about it again. With the internet, that's no longer an issue. We're reporting live about a standoff. We're reporting live about, we've had a rash of bank robberies, things like that. Because we have to make so many of these decisions on the fly, we have a style book. We have guidelines that we use. And it's a living document. For one example, like I mentioned with our urinal cake friend, we don't name names when police arrest someone, unless it's a very prominent person. If Governor Ricketts were arrested, we would probably say Governor Ricketts was arrested. In general, we wait to publish a name until charges have been filed. Because at that point, police can arrest anybody, but at that point, when charges are filed, a prosecutor has looked at the case and deemed that there is enough substance to it to move ahead. We have dollar thresholds. For example, I had to double check this before I left. If there is a household theft that involves more than $20,000, we'll report it. Now, I don't know what I have in my house that's worth $20,000. Probably not going to end up in the paper. I got 4 kids. Anything that good, I try to keep out of the house. But $20,000 threshold, unless there's something unusual. I will promise you that sometime before Christmas, we will write a story, a roundup of all of the baby Jesuses that have been stolen from creches around Lincoln. Unless they're solid gold, they're not worth $20,000. But we'll write that story because it's a story of interest to people. We have rules, and then we bend them occasionally. We don't name victims. It's part of one of the most important things that we do is minimizing harm. And it can make for some difficult situations that don't seem quite right. The one that I struggle with, sometimes I still believe in it, but I wrestle with it, is a case of incest. If someone is charged with incest, we don't name them. And we don't name them because we're protecting the victim. Now that seems like that's not the kind of person. I don't necessarily want to protect the suspect. That's a bad thing to be charged with. And if you're found guilty, it's a bad thing to have done. But the overriding concern is not harming the victim. Now, if the person is charged with a crime, a first-degree sexual assault that doesn't imply a familial relationship or a domestic relationship, then that person's name would be used because there'd be a lot larger potential pool of victims. But we want to protect victims. We don't, if you stole something, if you found something worth $20,000 at my house and stole it, probably wouldn't run my name. This was stolen from the house of Editor Dave Bundy. It would, and we wouldn't give my address either because nobody'd know that there wasn't anything else of value in my house to steal. We would say the 2600 block of South 76th Street. We'd give some kind of vague identifier. And we usually do check it out because when you get out in the country, it may be the only house in that block. So we have to be sort of careful there too. One of the, it doesn't necessarily involve crime or justice, but it's certainly a very sensitive issue, and that is the issue of suicides and how those are reported in the paper. We generally don't write about them unless they have happened in a very, very prominent and public place that could have been witnessed by many people. And even then, we take pretty great pains to make sure that we provide as minimal a level of facts as possible. And we have tried generally to talk with the family as well. But you can do everything right and have a very complete style book and still run into stuff that you wouldn't expect. So I wanted to tell you about a couple of the instances that have kind of haunted me. And at the end, maybe you'll have some idea that I didn't have in dealing with it. The first one was from here in Lincoln, back in the summer of 2012. I was pretty new at the paper, and it was a long weekend, and I got a phone call from a reporter saying, I've got a very sensitive story. The story was about a woman who claimed that she was the victim of a hate crime. She was a lesbian, and she notified police that actually a neighbor called the police. She had been, three men had broken into her home. They had taken her clothes off, tied her to a chair with plastic ties. They had written horrible things on the walls of her home, and they had cut her. They'd cut, sliced her extremities, nothing life-threatening, but obviously painful. And he was calling me because he wondered, should we put in the story some of the things that were on the wall, the phrases, because they conveyed some of the horror of this crime. And then at the end, he said something that kind of stuck in my brain, but he said, police seem a little weird about this. And, it's a hate crime, and, hate crimes draw a lot of attention, and I wouldn't be surprised if I were a spokesman for the police department. I would be very careful in dealing with the media. Well, does anybody remember this story? It ended up being a lot more complicated. After I hung up with the reporter, the first thought, come back to Law and Order, you know what I do in my spare time when I can get a TV away from my kids? I thought about Law and Order, and I thought, what if this really wasn't a hate crime? And then I thought, well, somebody'd tell us. And as the story evolved over the course of the next week, it became clear that police did suspect that it was not a hate crime and that the crime had been staged by the victim. And as that became apparent to us, we wrote our stories more carefully. It's not necessarily legal cover, but reporters feel a lot better when they use the word alleged a lot. We threw the word alleged into a lot of stories. And we got a lot of flack because this story did become a national story. People complained to us, why aren't you supporting the victim more? Why are your stories written in this sort of muted tone? And, the story was picked up nationally by the website then at Gawker. They're out of business now because they got in a lot of trouble and got the pantsuit off of them by Hulk Hogan. But we ran the stories factual. We checked everything out. We felt very good about what we were doing in terms of accurate reporting, but we were just getting hammered by people. If you remember, there were vigils, there was lots of support. A fund was established to help the victim. And then, the case sort of started to kind of crumble, and it turned out the plastic ties had been purchased at a True Value where she bought a lot of supplies for her lawn mowing business and some projects she did around the house. She'd posted something on her Facebook page right before the attack happened saying that she was about to do something to shake things up. So eventually she was charged with filing a false report. She pleaded no contest, to which the judge was a little bit upset. The judge felt like the community needed closure. She was sentenced to community service and probation. She ended up having to spend a little time in jail because the community service aspect was not worked out. But, at first, as a media outlet, we were in trouble because we weren't supporting the victim and LGBT causes adequately. Later, the tide sort of turned, and obviously, this woman was troubled, and at the same time that we felt some vindication for the way we had covered the story, we didn't wish her any more harm than was already headed her way. So we needed to report the story. This is one that the community was invested in. We had to follow it through to the end. But we also did want to make sure that we did whatever we could within our guidelines to protect the victim. So that's complicated story number one. Complicated story number two happened while I was the editor of a paper in Bismarck, North Dakota. There, we had it was early one Saturday morning, a woman was found asleep in the driver's seat of a car at an intersection in a residential neighborhood, and there were drugs and drug paraphernalia in the seat next to her. She turned out to be a corrections officer. So this is somebody that we have entrusted with a law enforcement role. And so we reported, after the charges had been filed, that we had identified her by name and said that she was a corrections officer, that she had been charged with, I believe it was driving under the influence and possession of drugs and drug paraphernalia. She had an initial court hearing on a Friday, and it was early in the afternoon that the court hearing was scheduled. And we heard on the police scanner that they were looking for her because she did not show up for the court hearing. And in one of those times that, Usually things in life take a long time to play out. Nothing happens as fast as it does on a TV show. But that afternoon it did. They found her and she had committed suicide. She wasn't going to make that initial court appearance. And we figured out what happened, and we're sort of in the process of trying to figure out how to handle this. Do we write about it? Do we not write about it? And her boyfriend, who she had met not as a coworker, but as an inmate in the North Dakota State Penitentiary in Bismarck, he showed up at the newspaper offices demanding to see us. While he was downstairs, my phone rang, and I picked up the phone in my office, and it was the woman's mom. And she said to me, we were on the phone for a long time, but the message that she conveyed over and over again was, "You killed my daughter, and I want you to remember that every day of your life." And, you know, I'm a dad, I'm a newspaper editor. I followed the ethical rules that we had set out, and I felt rotten. And, you know, I mean, do I remember every single day of my life that story? No, but I have for the last week. And I do certain times of the year or every time I see a story similar to that. You know, we followed our policies, but we hurt a family. Now, were we solely responsible for her actions? Most people would say no, but did we contribute? It'd be hard to argue that being in the newspaper didn't add to the stress and strain of a criminal trial. So we were something I felt responsible for, and something I still wrestle with. And I think we did the right thing, but I wish there'd been another way out. Before I get to questions, I wanted to tell you about one other aspect of crime in courts reporting that the internet has just totally goobered up for us. And I hope that I haven't had a conversation with any of you about it, but 2 to 3 times a week, I get a phone call from someone who says, "I did something dumb a number of years ago, and you wrote a story about it. I was caught taking stolen stereo equipment out of the trunk of a car. It wasn't my equipment, it was a friend's, but I got convicted. And could you take it down? Because now I'm trying to get a job, and every time I Google my name, it's the first thing that comes up." And I deal with this a couple of times a week. I mean, sometimes it's really, really heartfelt and really a problem. Sometimes I just want to laugh. Like, the first thing I try to tell people is, stop Googling your name. Every time you Google your name and you hit that story, you raise that story so that your potential employer is more likely to see it. But the real answer is we don't unpublish news. If you've been charged with a crime, and we've written about it, and it's there, it's going to be there until some enormous solar flare wipes out all of the hard drives on this planet. I don't know how this is one of those areas that I just don't know how it's going to end, because stories were in archives before, but, you know, employers didn't come up and go through the microfilm to look for your name and see whether you'd, you know, ever gotten caught at a party doing something weird. They just don't. But now that anybody can Google a name or check out your Facebook page or whatever else, there's no hiding some things. 2 weeks ago, I dealt with a very rare case. I actually did take a story down. It was a story from 2004. And this guy called me and said, here's the story. It says I was charged with a crime, but I wasn't found guilty. He said, I don't even know what happened. Just 1 minute I was in jail, and the next minute I was gone, and nobody ever said anything else. And it was the case was, he was charged with being an accessory to a robbery that they thought was an inside job at an Amigos. They thought that he was the guy that held the gun while the Amigos employee tied himself up and showed him where to get the money. Well, it turned out police charged the Amigos employee and this guy who they said was the gunman. We went back and double checked, because obviously we can't just take his word for it. And it turned out the prosecutor said, yeah, actually we just there was no evidence. It turns out we just let him go. There were no charges. Charges were dropped, everything. So I thought, well, if there was ever an instance where, they didn't do anything with this, I'm okay taking that story down. If the case goes, if there's an initial court hearing, there's a public record started, we'll often put a note on top of the story that says, this case, charges in this case were later dropped. And the first thing I always ask people, is there anything in the story that's wrong? Because the first thing we want to do is correct anything. If you're ever mentioned in a news story and something's wrong, tell them. Because that's what will help you. And honestly, if you want to sue us, that's going to be the very first thing a lawyer asks. Well, did you ask him to fix it? We ended up blowing about $15,000 on a court case a couple years ago. An inmate with a typewriter and some knowledge of the law filed a lawsuit against us. And it was, even just, and it was, he'd never asked for a correction. There was ambiguity in the wording. Obviously, he was in jail, so in the prison system, so he had done something. And he'd actually done what we said he'd done. But, it's not easy even to get a case that simple, that much of a slam dunk, dismissed. So in the end, I guess the thing that I really want you to understand is crime in courts coverage is vital. It is of interest for readers for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are very natural and, what's going on around me? How can I protect my family? Some of them are less natural. What are these crazy fellow human beings doing to each other? But it's very important. Accuracy in this stuff is probably more important than anything else that we do, because every story, is a lawsuit waiting to happen if we haven't followed what we consider our best practices and if we haven't checked out everything that we can check out from our sources. One of the things that I love about being a newspaper editor is sort of the unpredictability of it. I don't know if when I come to work tomorrow, I don't know if I'm going to have somebody who's going to be able to insult me even better than the unicorns and Skittles guy. I don't know that we're not going to have some incredible news event. There are big things that you can see miles away, like an eclipse in August. That was a lot of fun to cover. But there are hard things that we deal with that happen very suddenly. I was the editor of a newspaper on September 11th, 2001. I was actually off that day, and I came jogging. I was out for a little run. I jogged up to my driveway, and my wife was in the driveway saying, "You better go to work right now." And I went in, watched the TV for about 20 seconds and realized, yeah, I better go to work right now. And, that was one of those days where you do some of the best work you'll ever do. And then you look back and you think, what a miserable, miserable time to have to do your best work. And, not everything rises to that level. But you never know what the next day is going to bring. And one of the things that I always try to remember myself too about crime and courts reporting is, while a lot of these cases end up seeming to be routine, we're generally dealing with people on one of the worst days of their lives. Most people don't make it a habit to get in trouble with the law and to go to court. And as such, we need to treat them with respect and care as much as we possibly can. So with that, do folks have questions?
Well, as they're thinking, I'll tell you, that was a tremendous presentation. I feel our students who didn't come today really missed out. That was fascinating. Thank you. Gayleen?
Thank you for that very insightful information. I don't even know where to start. I have so many questions because I feel like the media just globally plays a huge role in the criminal justice system and perceptions and everything. So I'll just start with throwing out the question of asking for your perspective on how the media, whether it's here in Lincoln or just globally, do you feel is influencing the ongoing relationship, I suppose, between the community and law enforcement? There is some research and so forth is saying media is affecting the communities a certain way, affecting law enforcement a certain way in pursuing stories that portray citizen and police interaction either coming from this side or that side, and that to the extent that it's even affecting the officers themselves and the officers' perceptions about their own profession. So just kind of a global question, if you could talk a little bit about that particular area in whatever direction you want to take it.
Okay, well that's, between the time that I was the editor in Bismarck and the time that I got here to Lincoln, I was the editorial director for the Suburban Journals of Greater St. Louis. So, and St. Louis has always seemed to me sort of like ground zero for this from a couple of summers ago. And, I think nobody likes to be stereotyped, and that's the difficulty. One of the difficulties here. I think that sort of globally, the media has always tried to be a voice for the voiceless. The media also wrestles with the perception that whether it's trying to sell papers or trying to get web hits or TV viewers or radio listeners, that we foment conflict. And where do you draw the line? And I'd probably be the ruler of all media if I knew the right answer. I feel like in Lincoln, and I could speak to this too as a reporter whose first job was covering crime and courts and a police department in a little town called Ashland, Ohio. Ultimately, reporting rests on relationships. If you don't have a working relationship with law enforcement, you cannot do an effective job of chronicling crime and justice issues. And I think in Lincoln here, when we have had an issue, we have a very good relationship with the police department, with the sheriffs. A little more difficult with the state patrol for a variety of reasons. But those relationships matter. Now, I as a cub reporter, I got so excited the first time I went out with 2 detectives on a stakeout to look for underage drinkers, that when they said, everybody knows us and we're kind of old, would you go through that bar real fast and see if anybody looks underage? I was like, yeah, I'm going to do police work. Now I look back on that and I'm like, I crossed a line there. I should not have done that. The coolest thing about that night really though was we ate sub sandwiches in the back of this van while we were staking out a convenience store. Ended up nobody got caught doing anything. It was really boring, but there's a tendency to kind of, you can build those relationships and make them too close, which is a danger too. But I think the relationship that we have with Chief Bleimeister here in town, he is an honorable, upstanding, good man who is doing a really good job. His folks, his media people are fair to us, fair to others, and they understand when we have to do a job that occasionally conflicts with them. But then, you've got national media. I think local media sort of has an investment. They need those relationships. National media, when they swoop in, they don't care. They're going to swoop out as soon as the story goes away. They can burn bridges. They can talk about off-the-record conversations. They can do whatever they want and then go. That doesn't mean that they do, but they're not invested in the local community the way we are, or the Post-Dispatch in St. Louis. So, I think globally that's a relationship that there's an issue. But at the same time, I think that there are, on a very local level, there are a lot of good relationships between police forces and the media where there is some understanding.
I saw another hand over here.
While the students are too shy to ask, let me ask you a kind of more selfish question, or for some of the students here, something they might face in the future as they move into positions of supervision and whatnot for a criminal justice agency, where they would be on the spot either as a PIO or representative of their agency or community organization. When the media is coming to the doorstep of someone in our field, how can somebody who's responsible for reporting out, whether it's individual contact with a reporter or in a broader situation, what would be a couple of tips that you could give to someone who must be responsive to media about a situation as a representative of that organization? I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
how do you interact successfully with the media to?
Well, obviously, the best thing is answer all of our questions as fast as you can and tell us everything we want to know. But that doesn't work in real life. There are ongoing investigations. There are lots of things that are happening on the law enforcement side that they can't be shared for a variety of reasons. There are things that are on the cusp where we'd always rather have more information than less. But I think the biggest thing is to have an understanding of the deadline pressure that reporters are under. And if you don't know something or you can't say something, tell us. Because I always think it looks bad for everybody when the story says so-and-so was unavailable for comment. If we've gotten in touch with you and you've said, I can't tell you anything about that right now, but I can maybe tell you tomorrow. That works a whole lot better than just not returning a call and being harassed. A lot of what, again, it goes back to relationships built over time. Hopefully a lot of things have happened before we show up on your door to ask those questions about that particular story, and there's some understanding and trust already built into it. But if it's the first time or you're trying to establish that, acknowledging that the reporter has a job to do and just telling them, I can't deal with you right now, but I'll deal with you at X time later, is a lot better than pretending like we don't exist. And, the police department's pretty good about coming back and telling us, we'll get back to you at a later time. When we're investigating things, I'll just say this, even though I'm not quite sure how big the audience is. When we deal with issues in the prison, it takes them a lot of time before they can figure out what they want to tell us or not. And in that time, they're relatively tight-lipped. They don't answer the phone and say, we're figuring something out. And I'd rather our folks know that they're trying to figure something out than we're unclear whether they have seen or even know that we're trying to get in touch with them.
Well, I have one. I actually fed this question to Mr. Bundy in advance, so I'm not blindsiding him, and I have it written down. It has to do with this Vegas scenario that we're certainly all familiar with. So my question, which you knew was coming. The next mass murderer is watching the news like the rest of us, and they see that mass slaughter is an avenue to fame. That reality resonates deep within more than just a few who feel that they have been overlooked in life, those who fervently feel that life has been unfair, or those who wish to make a statement in death. Charles Whitman's Before Your Time. A couple of us have gray hair, remember that case. Or in this generation, Omar Mateen. He's a gentleman down in Orlando. Of course, Las Vegas here last 2 weeks ago. With the saturated media coverage that comes from these episodes, we are bound to have copycat killers of this ilk, motivated by such warped perspectives. So the question with that preface, how do we balance this indirect impact of the media that popularizes the perpetrators of such horror with the public's need to know?
I was really glad that you gave me that in advance. I can say that the Columbine shootings were a turning point in newsrooms in the late 90s. You're probably familiar with those. But that's when the discussion really started about not glorifying the shooters and turning the focus on the victims. Human nature says, I want to see the face of whoever could do this. And, we showed people those faces the first day. But after that, we tried to minimize the number of times we ran the faces of Dylan Klebold, and I can't remember the other boy. But we did not, we worked hard not to run that mugshot repeatedly. And instead, whenever we had the chance, we ran the faces of the victims. I was proud in the aftermath. I was part of a group here in Lincoln. We wrote a series called The Outsiders. We didn't write a story about, these are the number of gun-related incidents in LPS, or these are the number of bullying incidents or anything like that. We wrote about the people that felt marginalized in school populations. We wrote about individuals. We talked to older kids who had felt like that and had sort of navigated that time in their lives successfully. Human beings are sadly resourceful, and that's the thing that was the thing that struck me about Las Vegas. I mean, and maybe I've mischaracterized it, but I just couldn't remember a time where somebody knocked out a window X number of hundreds of yards away and just sprayed gunfire into a crowd. I mean, those more targeted shootings they were horrific, but this was like a new brand of horror. And, you know, I don't want the blood of the next mass shooting to be on, well, I don't want it to happen. And yet, you know, it's by reporting some of these things. I mean, do I think that Las Vegas hotels are going to be more careful in checking luggage when people come in with lots and lots of luggage? I would hope that there's some efforts at reform, some fixes that can come from this. You know, I don't want to get into the gun control debate right now, but you got half the people say now's not the time to debate gun control when something horrible has just happened, and the other group is saying, why isn't this the perfect time? There is no better evidence. And, you know, maybe this bump stock thing is I mean, if nothing changes but that, maybe that's something useful to come out of this. But, you know, I think that the media tries to satisfy some minimal level of curiosity about the perpetrators. And then, you know, whether we're do a good job or a bad job, I just know that we try, at least in my newsroom, to put the focus on the victims. And by doing that, you know, that's one of the only avenues I can see to deny the perpetrators the spotlight. And maybe you have ideas as media consumers who, you know, I still think about news is the top strip on the front page of the newspaper and whether we run a little mugshot of a shooter that big. And you guys see news totally differently. So if anybody has thoughts, I would welcome them.
Thank you. I do see time is far spent. It's 1 o'clock, and I know you have classes to go to and the like. You got to go back and check the latest news hit on the app.
Got to make sure we're doing something this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.